Welcome everybody. My name's Andy Marks. I am the chair of Western Sydney Community Forum and I'm absolutely delighted to have you all join us today for our forum on livability during COVID-19 and beyond. I'm fortunate to be joined by some wonderful guests today, and we'll look at exactly what livability means across the areas in which they intersect. I'll introduce them to you now. We have Heather Chaffey, who's the Divisional Manager of Social Sustainability with Wentworth Community Housing. Welcome, Heather. We have Dare Kavanagh, Regional Manager of Social Sustainability with Lendlease. G'day, Dare. And Dr. Eddie Jackson, Director of City, Community and Culture with Liverpool City Council. G'day, Eddie. So livability, really a term that is quite new in some respects, but it's used with, I guess, a very, very high level of regularity by both government in planning and policy making generally. It was one of the areas under the Western Sydney City Deal that 3 levels of government committed to delivering. And it was also, I think, very much at the core of some of the thinking agencies like the Greater Sydney Commission have infused into their 30-minute city concept. But livability is tossed around so much you could be forgiven for thinking that it has lost some of its meaning. And today we're going to try and get to the heart of that and unpack really what it does mean for people at the community level. I might begin with you, Heather, and I think that one of the things that we consider to be a fundamental aspect of livability is housing. Although livability extends across the whole range of housing in some respects. What does it mean for somebody in community housing, and how do they understand livability?
Well, that's an interesting question and hard for me to answer as someone who has the privilege of not living in, well, having more control over my own housing situation. I think maybe before I go there, I just want to acknowledge that I'm with you today on Darug land. So I'm sure people are a lot across many different lands in this conversation, but personally today I'm sitting on Darug land in my beautiful house in the Lower Blue Mountains. So I just want to acknowledge that. And of course it's National Sorry Day, which I think might be spoken about a little bit today as well. But from my perspective, I think livability means much more than what we actually often talk about, because we talk about physical space, shared space, common space, and those things are so important. And in Western Sydney, we've got absolutely stunning space, and there's been a really great focus on that in recent years. But I think livability, from my perspective, also often for people who don't have a lot of money, who don't have access to privately owned vehicles, who potentially don't own their home, it's at a much more neighbourhood level. So literally down to things like the quality of footpaths, how much shade there is along a street, the impact of heat, of growing heat, of heat abatement, and the work that local councils do in that space is so important to a person's mental health, to their well-being, in terms of the space where they live, even the proximity of where we live. And I think that's been very obvious to me during the COVID pandemic that, you know, I'm so blessed just to have a lot of space here. And I know that a lot of people that don't have that kind of income just are living right on top of each other. And we've seen that in places, especially, you know, some of the examples coming out of New York and other places. So I think for me, livability is actually about wealth. It's about planning legislation and the history of that. So I know that places that were built prior to legislated developer contributions, we see those places decline, those neighbourhoods decline, and the housing there is often cheaper, but it also is less livable in a number of ways. So you see councils like Penrith City Council have had the foresight many years ago to put in place a special rate variation for established areas, and taking proactive action around that. So local government becomes incredibly important. I can't believe I'm saying that. And local communities and neighbourhood the concept of neighbourhood, and not just the massive geographic expanse of a place like Western Sydney. Yeah, I think those things are important. And I also think digital literacy and the digital divide are something that we should talk about in terms of livability in the context of something like COVID. Because a lot of people, when you don't have access to that, to community online and to that kind of tech and ability, we see people get left behind.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And we will talk about connectivity. And thank you for the acknowledgement too earlier on. It was remiss of me in the rush to jump in, not to acknowledge National Sorry Day, of course, which dates back to 1998, and very fundamental in terms of the discussion around housing, you know, given that the day itself arose in response to the Bringing Them Home report. So thank you for that. And I think that you've really led me on to something that leads into Eddie's territory with your reference to local government. Yes, local government can do, if you like, unusually innovative things, but that's a little cruel, I think, in terms of Liverpool's stance, because they've proven to be very, very innovative in the community space. So, Eddie, what does Liverpool mean for council, and what does it mean for southwestern Sydney?
Sorry, what does livability mean for council? Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute. Andy, I think you raise a fundamental point in terms of saying, what do we mean by the concept of livability? I was part of the negotiation team within Liverpool and within the 8 councils around the city deal. And the notion of livability came in from left at the very end of that process from a federal level. And I'm interested in Heather's comments about fundamentally being about wealth, because one of the things that united the 8 councils was that strong sense of public value and equity, and a strong feeling that Western Sydney had intentionally or otherwise suffered structural discrimination over many decades. And I think that's an important starting point in that discussion. I think from a local authority point of view, and certainly from my perspective as Director of Community and Culture, there tends to be a reductionist approach to it that says livability means parks, community halls, aquatic centres, leisure centres. And it's the hard side of what is generally regarded as soft community infrastructure. I think the whole COVID experience has shattered the complacency of everyday taken for granted experiences, interactions, and shared experiences. It has emphasized the importance of outdoor public space, public places, and for so long now the narrative has been about precinct planning, place planning, and design-led approaches to that. I think the COVID experience has clearly demonstrated and emphasized that the importance of the human interaction, of trust, reciprocity, and social contract is back on the agenda and an integral part of that, however we define the concept, because it is a contingent concept. I think what's more important is that we look at the practice of that. And certainly the experience within Liverpool has been to open up all sorts of new working relationships in a way that we hadn't envisaged previously. I think we've broken through a lot of barriers across sectors, across communities, and I think it provides a great opportunity for us going forward in terms of developing new networks, new partnerships, and new approaches to something that we all now recognise is absolutely fundamental to how we live and work and go about our daily lives.
I think that structural change that came through in government, astounds me that it took a pandemic for government to treat people on New Start decently and to, in effect, make that income livable. And I think that's a start, at least from an economic standpoint. Dara, I want to talk to you about the way we reimagine place in the context of livability. And I'm looking at, yes, I'm going to do it. I'm going to quote something from Lendlease's mission statement, which is to leave a legacy people care about. Yeah. Is livability something people care about in terms of the way Lendlease go about things? Do you think? How highly does it rate?
Oh, very, very high. Couldn't be higher. Before I go into that, I'll also acknowledge National Sorry Day, pay my respects to elders past and present. I'm joining you all here today from Gadigal country. And I also want to acknowledge on Sorry Day the incredible leadership that Aboriginal elders in particular have shown in relation to resilience. And I think resilience is a really important thing for all of us to be looking to understand more in this time. And there's no people on the planet that have demonstrated resilience to have a continuous culture for 60,000 years. So back to our mission and place, you know, I think that a company like Lendlease takes their responsibilities in terms of placemaking very, very, very seriously. And ultimately, if you look at projects, Heather and I, in our chat as we were speaking before we started, referenced Jordan Springs, which is, of course, the extension of work that Lendlease did at Ropes Crossing, and will continues into the future. If they're not building a livable place for the Ropes Crossing people that moved in, you know, sort of 15 years ago, no one is going to want to be part of that community into the future. So they see that very much as what they're contributing to. And that's, for me, sort of that the value alignment around that was what allowed me to feel comfortable in shifting into working for a company like that. If I can just make a couple of comments on something that both Heather and Eddie said that I think kind of link together in thinking about is wealth the issue, and is trust and reciprocity the key aspects. And I think there's something with both of those that have to do with livability, where greed as the opposite side in a way of wealth. Doesn't matter if some people have a lot of money, but if they're greedy about it and they're not sharing and they're not participating in a community with reciprocity and building trust, that's where we end up with the problem, where then we silo people out and have that separation. And I think those are the aspects of that, sort of different sides of that coin, where things can either turn to be fantastic or turn to be very, very problematic.
I want to, at this point, also encourage you to leave your comments and questions, of course, using the Q&A function, and raise your hand as well as we work through this if you have a burning issue that you want us to address. But Dara, I think you set the scene very well in terms of establishing the next area I wanted us to look at, which was around that point Heather raised too, around digital connectivity. There is a very big civic discourse going on now across these type of fora as to what type of world we want to have post-COVID. And I think that it always strikes me that we've disenfranchised an incredibly large section of society from contributing to that conversation simply because they don't have digital access. Is it almost something that sits alongside housing and as an essential, Heather, for you in terms of I guess its need in society?
Yes, I think so. And that's new to me. So I don't want to pretend that that I'm totally across that and that I know a lot about it. But I think certainly my reflection in the impact of COVID, the way that we have had to adapt our work and how we are able to work with our clients and other stakeholders, and the way that I've observed others do that, it's very, very evident to me that we need to do something about that. That it's incredibly significant, and in the context of COVID, it's meant reverting to literally phone calls, to having to think about outreach programs that might only get to a handful of people when you've got thousands of clients. So it's been a struggle, and I have no answers for it right now, except that that digital divide for me is clearly along. I feel worried about being so brazen, but it's along a poverty line. And I know that a lot of people have access to smartphones and other things, and I'm not a tech person at all, so I'm going to come undone in this conversation. But there's a lot of functionality that isn't available in those things. And it's been hard enough for me to, as someone, you know, a professional with a lot of qualifications and experience who uses computers every day, it's been hard enough for me to adapt under these circumstances, let alone some of our clients, or particularly older people, I think, are really missing out here.
Yeah, I think that's, and it's very concerning, I think, that these conversations are going on without some of the most impacted people at the table. And Eddie,
yeah,
I really want to, on that note, tried to unpack a little bit more of the City Deal interpretation of livability, and we've had a really good comment from Anonymous, rhymes with Hieronymus, who has said something which I think really captures one of the deficiencies of the deal, is that the Livability Fund is really about parks, swings, playgrounds, nothing in livability under the City Deal about the stuff we've been talking about. Nothing in there at all. How do we change that conversation and adjust the deal? It's not a good thing to adjust the deal halfway through it, but I think we have to because it's just not engaging the issues we're talking about. How do we do that, Eddie?
Look, I'm a fan of the City Deal. Is it perfect? No, it's not. I spent 20 years in Belfast working under the European Union, trying to promote the structures and the processes of social partnership to bring into the table and get a seat at the table of all the civil partners alongside business, government at all levels. And social partnership, in my view, is by far the most effective structure and process of governance that actually leads to sustainable outcomes. Is it easy to do? No, it's not. In terms of the City Deal, the reality is that the livability element of that and the 120 million contribution by state and federal government, which was then matched by initially a 30 million contribution from the 8 local authorities. It's now up, I think it's about 70 million. It was the inducement to bring all 8 councils to the table. That's the reality of it. Nobody believed that 8 councils would actually work together in an effective network and join with their colleagues in state and federal government to produce the City Deal. And that was the political reality of it. How do we elevate that conversation? Well, I believe that there are 2 missing elements in it for me, and I've said this all the way through the process. One is that civil society doesn't have a seat at the table. Yes, we've got 3 tiers of government. Yes, we've got a lot of agencies. We do not have civil society, nor do we have developers, financial institutions, the aids and maids, all of those people who need to be at the table. Government cannot do this on its own. The structures actually work. They're pretty cumbersome, but they're an improvement, and they can be done, or they can be made to work better. But we need to have that inclusion of civil society and other partners in this journey. Andy, say you don't want, it's not a good time. Actually, it's a perfect time because the City Deal is set for review at the end of, I think it's June 21, 3 years after its signing. Now's the perfect time to make representation to government at all levels and to all of the key players within that, to say we need to widen the conversation. We have bedded down the process. We have built trust across the different levels of council, but now it's time to widen this out, because we need to bring everybody's contribution, everybody's expertise and to the table. And the critical thing, and I'll argue it strongly, as I have in the past, and I'll be very keen to hear Dare's position on it. We need to, government cannot finance the livability and the community infrastructure that is required to realize the ambition of the city deal itself. Doesn't have the money. So therefore, we need to bring in financial institutions and different systems of finance and different partners to actually realize the ambition.
Now, on that point, so Anonymous is back on the Q&A again, and thank you for your input, whoever you are. They make the point as well that livability's become a story of facets of privilege. I'd agree with that, but I'd also suggest it's become a story that's in love with infrastructure, with building stuff, with built form, with ribbon cutting exercises that politicians can engage in. How do we bust that apart? And how do you do it if you're Lendlease, again, Darren, and you're in the business of building things? How do we deliver livability that actually means something to people beyond built form?
You know, that's the kind of role that, you know, both Heather and I have in terms of the various communities we're working in. You know, I think that there's so much that happens with the space, and then there's the stuff that happens in between. And the catalyst for change that a good community development worker can be, or where you have that civil society involvement. And I think creating the spaces for that to happen, inviting people to be part of that conversation so that people themselves can have their own agency in their neighborhood and be able to make the kind of change that that's required. Part of that is having, you know, the bricks and mortar facilities, but a lot of it is what happens in between. How do we provide that the kind of support and infrastructure in terms of people power and ideas and the small bits that can actually make a difference and allow people to get together. You know, in my own neighborhood, I'm part of a number of different groups that just get on and make things happen. When I worked in public housing, there were people there that were the volunteers, the canteen operators at schools, all of those kinds of things. And I think what's our role in terms of helping to follow those sparks, feed the fire that's already there in communities. And I think there is no better time to be in community development now. And all of the NGOs who are the membership and here participating in the forum today would be the people who will see that, you know, you can get. And that's, I think, what Eddie was saying. If the only folks at the table are those who are the local government bodies that are looking at the hard infrastructure of parks, and you don't have the civil society, where is your Rotary Club or similar? Where is the RFS people? And you know, I think our roles in terms of social sustainability is providing enough of a trampoline for people to then go forward with.
Yeah, I think
going nuts here.
No, not at all. In fact, you've led me onto, I think, a vitally important topic and a very challenging one. Heather Nesbitt makes a great point that livability is much wrapped up in the notion of a safe and affordable home. And that again goes into your space, Heather, to a degree. But I want to talk about the notion of safety in the context of the domestic violence levels that we've seen intensify on early accounts during this lockdown period. Even affordable homes can be an incredibly unsafe space. And we've found that's particularly pronounced at the moment. How do we engage with that in terms of livability, and how do we get those people the support they need?
Sorry, I had a thought process, and then Andy's just said something that's taken me in a different direction. So I kind of want to try and meld the two. So bear with me here. I just wonder, like, just now, both Eddie and Dare, Eddie used the word inclusion, and Dare, I think, said involve. And I wondered, from my professional history and the frustrations, I guess, of working in a new system now and getting to learn about it, I wonder what it would really take for us to actually empower communities around even things like domestic violence, to your point, Andy, because maybe this is a little too radically left, but I wonder what would happen if we allowed communities to have decent resource to make decisions about what livability looks like in that community, in that neighbourhood, and to then work backwards the other way. Because often what happens is we say the political ideology and the people who've been elected to power of the day think this, that and the other about these issues. And therefore, this is the policy direction, and the money will be allocated according to that. And then all the lovely people who are given access to that money will control the way that that's rolled out into communities. And some of them will include people, and some of them will involve people, but none of us are ever really able to empower people. I've never got there in my whole career. So I wonder what it would look like if we were actually able to empower those communities to make those decisions, and whether that engagement then would lead to more substantial change over a longer period of time than the way we do it now, which to me, just kind of after 20 years in the field, I think this is just kind of back to front. There's always something that's pigeonholing what I'm able to do here. And if the issue here is really housing and early childhood education, then that's what we should work on. But it shouldn't be me that's deciding that.
So I think that sort of intersects with, there's been a lot of panel love in the last few weeks, and I've been on a few, and one of them I was on last week was about public space. And I think it was Philip Tallis who mentioned that dissent is a great characteristic of public space. So the way people don't do what governments want them to do in public space is a wonderfully dynamic thing that actually gives characteristics to communities and to those little spaces that we inhabit. That's in effect, Heather, a bit like the bottom-up revolution I guess you're asking for. But Eddie, you're in the business of planning, community, culture, all of those things that are really fluid. Through a structure like council that's actually, in some respects rigid, how do you make space for dissent in terms of livability, and how do you celebrate it at Liverpool?
Well, good question, Andy. And this is something that I've worked in and studied for a long time, because conflict and contest of public space is how Belfast operates, and how many other societies, many other cities around the world work out those sovereign conflicts within the city space. Those contests come to ground in urban areas, and public space is therefore part of that conversation and that contest. Liverpool is characterised by high levels of diversity. We've got over 152 different ethnic groups. By and large, they mix well, they get on well together, but there's often a separateness about that. So it's benign separateness rather than actually being a cohesive neighborhood or society. Our approach has been, you know, and domestic violence in particular is it's one of those wicked problems. Government alone cannot solve that problem. But our approach to that is, on one hand, to work with the local area command and encourage people who report domestic violence to actually, at the point where that's happened, to prosecute that. You know, you mentioned safety there as well. That's an important part. Within certain cultural groups, there is almost a cultural acceptance of domestic violence as being justified in some way or other. So there's an educational element as well. And through our view is that we have to take a long-term approach to this through early education, through the work of the Children's Parliament in the 2168 postcode, for example, where we have got 10 public primary schools. We work with the children to identify the issues that are pertinent to them. Domestic violence is one that the children themselves have identified. And we work through them on an educational process that begins to challenge those traditional norms or accepted practices. I think this is where it's one of those areas where local government can play a significant role, because and I think council has been very good on that in terms of setting itself up and becoming a member of the White Ribbon organisation prior to that particular organisation coming into difficulties. But political messaging on a cross-party basis to say, no, you know what, this isn't acceptable, is part of that. In terms of our public spaces and how we plan them, how we plan our precincts, we do a lot of work around the demographics of any given place. Carnshill is a great example of a successful precinct. People in those neighbouring communities they come from everywhere in the world. They are professional, they're aspirational, they're working class, they cross all sectors. Before we come forward with plans for any community infrastructure, we spend a considerable amount of time trying to consult with them to get their input, so that whatever the final product is, that we reflect the needs and the desires and the aspirations of communities.
So that's a really good point. Whatever the final product is, it reflects those needs. And that leads me on to another element that is characteristic of livability in Western Sydney, is it's bloody hot out here. You wouldn't think so today. Today's an exception.
It's also cold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just went through one of the hottest summers on record. I won't even go into the issue of global warming and politics at that level, because that's a whole other forum. But one of the livable spaces, most livable spaces for people in Western Sydney during that kind of weather is the mega mall. And Lendlease, again, have a history in that space as well. And I'm not being critical. I'm actually suggesting that there may be a role to play in livability in the way that we reimagine those spaces. How does Lendlease engage with that issue in terms of those spaces, not just being for retail, but actually, being kind of defunct or defaulting to spaces for livability in the context of climate? Does Lendlease make account of that, or is it just a byproduct?
No, I think that it depends really, like so many things, it comes down to the local management. So our main big shopping centre in Western Sydney is MacArthur Square down in Campbelltown. I know there's a sort of Western Sydney, Southwestern Sydney divide, but that's the big one. And I think they take their role there very seriously. And the centre management understands. I mean, I can't even imagine how many shops are going to be closed after this that won't open again. And so spending the time to reimagine what else could it be. And certainly down there, they opened adult and kids sort of play areas that, where they put in false walls in shops that are vacant, have it open, put down the AstroTurf, have climb on activity things and different stuff. Been working very well with the fabulous head librarian in Campbelltown Council to have library reading sessions in the shopping center there. I would love to see co-working centers to be in those shopping centers and things like that, that actually breathe a bit of life into those spaces beyond just the consumer perspective, but allow there to be opportunities for people to take a break from the heat, to be that kind of town square and to take their place as part of the social infrastructure. And again, that comes back to what does it mean place by place, what's going to be appropriate. So that's definitely a big topic of conversation right now.
Great points. And I think on the topic of conversation too, don't forget that as participants, you can raise your hand and you can ask a question live on screen. Anonymous, this is your big chance because we're getting some pretty good comments coming through. Get out there, give us a look at you and tell us what you think of livability.
Can I add to what Deb's just said, Andy, in the context of community housing, because I think it's really interesting, the housing system here in New South Wales, and again, I'm so not an expert. I'm learning so much so rapidly, having worked in community housing for all of 2 years now. But I think there's a really exciting opportunity for governments to consider about how they enable community housing to redevelop in future so that we can actually have a greater impact on heat, particularly in Western Sydney. So we recently, Penrith experienced the hottest day on earth in early January, and the heat waves that we're experiencing, all of the work that WesRock and all of the member councils have done, the science coming out of Western Sydney University and other universities studying heat, the heat island effect and heat abatement in Western Sydney. Again, like digital literacy, this is a social justice issue, and it's very important that we start to talk about that, and that we start to talk about that in a way that encourages government to enable community housing to do some great development like Lendlease is able to do, where we can build new housing and construct housing for people who are on low incomes. That means that they can live without unbearable heat. I fear that we will see people start to die if we don't enable that system to build new housing that's appropriate for Western Sydney.
And it's incredibly
I don't know the answer to that, but
it's incredibly localised too, because you have this situation with heat build-up, heat island build-up, where you can have a car park space 10 degrees hotter than somewhere else down the road. So
yes, it's unbearably hot, and we know that that's particularly true for Penrith and the Hawkesbury, and both of those regions are also at significant threat around flood and bushfire. So we kind of have these looming natural disasters to consider when we're talking about livability. Also, just wanted to briefly, I'm not a domestic violence expert, but lovely Eddie gave us a really eloquent note before about public space and included a reflection on domestic violence. And I just wanted to say that although domestic violence is culturally different, the way that we accept it, one of the cultural groups where it's really prevalent is actually Anglo-white Australia.
Absolutely.
So patriarchy and violence and male violence against women is not something that is exclusive to any demographic, cultural or a socioeconomic group. And I just wanted to say that.
And I concur wholeheartedly.
Thank you, Eddie.
Crosses all boundaries. That's why it's so complex, and to even solve that on a case-by-case basis is very, very difficult. It's complex.
So complex,
And
it gets worse when it's hot. It gets worse when it's hot.
It does.
Everything gets worse when it's hot. I'm just, in terms of one of the aspects, I think, that will have a positive impact on livability and on climate, to sort of take us back from that looking at that in particular, and in a way, you know, from some theories, you might say so in terms of reducing domestic violence, is I think my favorite, bar none, Western Sydney new neighborhood that's being built is actually not a Lendlease one, is Edmondson Park. I think Ed is going to be a fabulous addition to Liverpool. And I think why I think so there in terms of the climate change aspect is the kind of density that they have creates space for green space to be throughout it. And the housing itself is concentrated, but then it has some other space and has the shops right there at the train station. So I can't say I know it in huge detail, but having been there, and there's one in Parramatta Council that also has that very good sort of mix that's just coming up, which is also not a Lendlease one, but is so don't tell anybody that I said so. But
our lips are sealed.
Yes, anonymous. Don't
do it, anonymous. Don't do it. Listen,
Melrose Park is also looking good, and I think that examples of good density that is sympathetic to a suburban setting and that has the services right there, allows there to be enough people, enough jobs for the services to be able to thrive. And then you have that kind of opportunities for the stuff we started off with when we were talking about reciprocity, trust, sharing wealth, sharing space, you know, and those kind of, that sort of a node development, I think can be very effective in terms of creating those the kind of livability outcomes that allow the less dense areas further outside them to then also flourish.
Okay, now this talking about flourishing, we're heading into the home stretch, and I actually want to ask you to use your imaginations for a second. Now imagine you're in government and all of a sudden out of nowhere you found $60 billion you didn't know you had. It sounds like it could never happen, right? But just imagine. Now, if you could take only 6 billion of that, right? Just 10% of it to devote towards livability. What would you spend that 6 billion on? Now, Eddie, I'm going to you first, mate, because you're actually in government. And all of a sudden you've got $6 billion to spend on livability in Western Sydney. Yep. Where does it go?
There are a lot of places it could go, Andy. If you're asking me to determine where at least some of it goes, I'd charter a couple of flights when we open up again. I would take senior government officials alongside private sector representatives, universities. I would go to cities like Boston, Pittsburgh, and see how other parts of the world do livability in a way that is different and better from New South Wales. We have got to learn from best practice elsewhere, and 6 billion is nothing. With all due respect, it is nothing in terms of the requirements of the Western Sydney Parkland City. We need to look at how we can introduce new models of finance, new market mechanisms, and promote partnerships as part of that, and networks, so that we can actually deliver in a way that will realize the potential of this wonderful part of the world. And we're not doing that currently. There's no point in trying to divvy up, you know, a bit here, a bit there. We need the real connectivity. We need the network of transport that will make Western Sydney Airport and the Aerotropolis successful. We need all the expertise that the private sector, the financial sector, the academic sector, and the medical sector can bring to the table so that we can create the 200,000 additional jobs that is set in the city deal. That in itself isn't enough. We've got to be more ambitious and develop an international mindset. So I wouldn't ask for too much of that 6 billion.
Sounds like you haven't got much change left there, Eddie, but really, really good points. Dare, you know what I'm going to ask you. The Treasurer has been on the phone. She's found $6 billion. You're the Prime Minister. You've got $6 billion to spend on livability. Where does it go?
I think I'm actually a great fan of doing just direct cash to people. I have to say, I think individuals know what they want to spend it on. Let's get it moving around to the community, and have people, you know, the more we're shopping local, staying at home, putting that money into your own life, I think that I would be extending the job seeker, job keeper, and keeping the money in the pockets of people who can then make a difference in their own family life and in their neighborhoods. And I think that's yeah, that'd be my choice. I'd keep that going.
I think surprisingly, it's a good choice. I think that the increase in New Start actually costs the government less than $6 billion. Yet they're talking about cutting it off in September.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Both fantastic ideas from Minister Kavanagh and Minister Jackson. Heather, I think you know what I'm going to ask you. What do you do with your $6 billion to deliver livability?
I have to apologise because the sun's just come out and it's officially blinding me. And I can't do anything about it. I was just sitting here thinking I need to get up and change the blind, but you asked me a question, so I'll be sun-soaked. What do I do with $6 billion? I'm with Dare. I say give it to people. Give it to people who need it and watch them go. They're going to spend it locally. They're going to spend it on things they need. I'd be really curious to look at those issues that we've talked about as well, particularly, I mean, I don't think $6 billion is going to do much about heat abatement, but that, you know, it's, you know, perhaps we could do some thinking around that, but certainly in terms of transport and accessibility particularly in older established areas across Western Sydney. So I think that continues from my perspective to be a really big issue for people who can't get themselves around as easily anyway. So I'd be looking at public transport, local solutions and giving people money to buy things that they need.
Yeah, I think that's been one of the big learnings from today is that we need a far more bottom-up approach to livability than the one that we currently have. And
to everything.
Yeah, and I think this panel's been really astute at illustrating that people don't need to have more things done to them. They need to be doing things by them, for them, at that local level. And ideally, that's how livability will really be achieved. And all of you, in one way or another, were essential in bringing that point to light. So much so, Heather, that you literally brought it to light directly in through your window. But thank you all for a really wonderful discussion. Thanks to everybody out there that contributed on the Q&A. I even mean you too, Anonymous, because that's exactly what it's about. It's not about our voice, it's about you. And
there was a correction there from Anonymous that I wondered if we should read out regarding.
Please go for it.
Statement. So, and just for the record, I just think it's important to acknowledge when people dissent, Andy. So the comment had said, it's not correct to say that most cultural groups have an acceptance of domestic and family violence. Different cultures have varying worldviews. This does not equate to an acceptance of domestic violence. This is an overly simplistic assessment and neglects to understand the nuances of culture and life experiences beyond ethnicity or language.
Yeah, very true. I think the lovely Eddie addressed that, quote unquote, very well. And I think that's been another aspect of today's discussion that's come to the fore. It is about how we overcome those challenges locally. And I think that that is how we start to talk about livability. And that's not through city deals. It's not through any other structure other than how we empower people at home. So all of you helped us to get to that point. So thank you so much to my panelists, to Heather, to Dare, and to Eddie. Thank you also to everyone out there that contributed to the discussion, and even those who aren't at the table, as I mentioned earlier on. as chair of the forum, I'm really, really keen, and Billy and all of the team and the rest of the board are working very hard to make sure those voices that aren't at the table digitally are being heard. And I know a lot of us are doing that work, and it's so very important. I think we have some more of these forums coming up, that said, and these ones are available on YouTube afterwards. So if you loved it so much the first time, you want to watch it again, you know where to go. And also don't forget to share that with your friends. And with that message, I'll close off for today. And again, we do acknowledge National Sorry Day, and that has so much to do with our concept of livability, given that it's a legacy that's been around for more than 60,000 years. So with that, I'll bid you farewell, and we'll see you at the next forum. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Thanks, Dare. Thanks, Eddie.
Thank you. Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Eddie. Thanks, Andy. That was great.
Thanks all.
Bye, Andy.